Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're not just looking at, a piece of history. We're questioning the timeline itself. Like, what if I told you that the calendar hanging on your wall, the dates in the books, they're fundamentally wrong? That maybe 300 years of the Middle Ages just poof, never happened. That's the core idea behind something called the phantom time hypothesis.
Okay.
Well, it's pretty mind-bending. We're going to dig into the sources behind this really radical claim. It came from a German historian, Herbert Illig, back in the late 20th century. And his argument basically is that the years between 614 AD and 911 AD, they were either faked or massively misdated, almost 300 years.
It's a huge claim, a really breathtaking proposition, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go along with the phantom time hypothesis, the PTH,
Yeah.
then, well, things like the Carolingian Renaissance, the rise of Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdoms, that whole chunk of the early Middle Ages, it might all be essentially a fabrication, or at least misplaced in time. So our mission today is to look at the weird anomalies Illig and his supporters point to as evidence, and then critically apply the counter-arguments to see why, the vast majority of historians think this idea of a massive conspiracy just doesn't hold up.
It really is staggering to think about. I mean, if 300 years are missing, then right now the year wouldn't be 2025, it'd be more like 1725. And someone like Charlemagne, who we think of as, shaping Europe, he could be way off date-wise, or maybe not even a single person.
Exactly. The knock-on effects are enormous. Archaeology, art history, theology. The whole timeline of Western Europe kind of falls apart. And, for a fraud that big, you'd need a pretty extraordinary reason why.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. Why would anyone, assuming the real date was maybe closer to 700 AD, why invent 3 centuries? What's the alleged motive here?
So Illig doesn't see it as just some error. He argues it was deliberate, a calculated fraud, really, for political reasons, and he points fingers at some very powerful figures, Emperor Constantine VII in Byzantium, and then, crucially, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III working with Pope Sylvester II.
Hang on. You're talking about the Byzantine Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope. Weren't these guys often rivals? Why would Constantinople coordinate with the Holy Roman Empire to rewrite Frankish history? That sounds, well, incredibly complicated.
It does. But the argument centers on Otto III and the power of the year 1000, the turn of the millennium.
Yeah.
Illig suggests Otto III, ruling in what we call the late 900s, was obsessed with this idea of restoring Roman glory. And to make himself look like a true successor to emperors like Augustus or Constantine, he supposedly needed his reign to hit that big symbolic number, 1000 AD.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't 1000 AD yet, but he wanted it to be 1000 AD during his rule.
That's the core of the alleged motive. To shift the calendar forward. And to make that jump seem credible, you couldn't just leap from, say, 700 AD straight to Otto's time. You needed filler. So they supposedly fabricated about 300 years of history, inventing figures like Charlemagne, creating documents, all to bridge the gap and make Otto's reign look like the culmination of this continuous 1,000-year Christian empire.
So creating almost 3 centuries of fake history just to land on a nice round number for prestige, that is quite the accusation of historical manipulation, if it's true. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting then. The people who support this theory, they point to some genuinely odd things in the standard historical record. Anomalies, what's the sort of primary evidence they lean on?
Well, the big one is what they call the historical silence for that specific period, 614 to 911 AD. Proponents argue that if you look closely at the archaeology, there's a strange lack of reliable, securely dated stuff. Coins, buildings, you name it. And then there's the written record, which is also sparse. Many of the documents we do have from that time are later copies, or they have chronological inconsistencies. Some are suspected forgeries. For example, think about the papacy. This was supposedly a time of huge growth for the church, right? But the records of the popes themselves during these centuries, they're surprisingly thin, sometimes contradictory. Why would the most powerful institution in Europe, arguably, just not keep great records for 300 years?
That's a fair question. You'd expect the church, to be meticulous. And doesn't architecture show a similar kind of jump? Like, we go from late Roman styles, reusing old materials, sort of rougher construction after the empire fell, what you might call early Christian or maybe pre-Romanesque, and then boom, suddenly you've got the huge, complex Romanesque cathedrals of the 11th century. Where are the buildings from the 300 years in between? Where's the slow, gradual development?
Exactly. It's presented as a leap from fairly simple structures, maybe using old Roman bits and pieces, to these massive stone buildings with vaults, advanced engineering. The proponents ask, if the timeline is right, shouldn't we see hundreds of buildings showing that slow learning curve? Instead, they argue you see this gap. It conveniently lines up with those supposed phantom centuries. It's as if, architecturally, 950 AD came right after 650 AD. And to kind of back this up scientifically, Illig supporters bring in dendrochronology. Tree rings, right? That's the one. Dating wood using tree ring patterns. They claim that when you look at timber from Central Europe, dated to this period, the tree ring data doesn't quite line up smoothly with the accepted calendar for those specific centuries, the 7th, 8th, 9th.
Okay, help me out here. How exactly do tree rings show a 300-year gap? What's the disconnect?
So dendrochronology relies on matching patterns, wide rings for good years, thin rings for bad years. You build up a master timeline by overlapping samples.
Yeah.
The claim is, for timber supposedly from this 614-911 period in certain areas, their ring patterns sometimes seem to fit better or bridge more smoothly with wood that's dated later, say in the 10th century. It's like the trees themselves are missing the expected overlap for those specific 3 centuries needed to build that continuous master sequence for that region, suggesting, they argue, a kind of physical anomaly in the dating beyond just forged documents.
Wow. Okay, so we've got an alleged conspiracy involving emperors and popes, this historical silence, the architectural leap, and now tree rings. But we have to flip the coin now.
Apply some criticism to the criticism, right?
Yeah.
Why do almost all mainstream historians just dismiss this whole idea?
Right. And the first biggest hurdle is just the sheer logistical nightmare of it all, the scale. Pulling off a fraud like this would require incredible coordination, near-perfect synchronization across completely different, often hostile, major powers. We're talking the Frankish kingdoms in the west, the Byzantine Empire in the east, and crucially, the Islamic caliphates. 3 different worlds.
Yeah, okay, maybe you could imagine the Franks and Byzantines having some weird shared interest, maybe. But pulling the Islamic world into a conspiracy run by a pope and a Holy Roman Emperor, that seems, well,
It
impossible.
really does. And the Islamic world is actually the nail in the coffin for the phantom time hypothesis. Because their calendar, the Hijri calendar, it's lunar. It started independently in 622 AD. It's not tied at all to the Julian or Gregorian calendars that the supposed plotters were messing with. So while Otto and the Pope were allegedly fiddling with the Christian calendar, the Islamic world was running on a completely separate system, oblivious.
Precisely. And that independent Islamic calendar, it has an incredibly detailed, continuous, well-documented history spanning this exact period that Illig claims is phantom 614 to 911 AD. I mean, during the centuries Illig says didn't happen, the Islamic world saw the rise of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. They expanded across North Africa into Spain. They founded Baghdad, which became this global center for science, maths, philosophy, preserving Greek text, huge intellectual activity.
So wait, to believe in phantom time, you also have to believe that the entire Islamic world, from Spain to Persia, simultaneously invented 300 years of its own sultans, scientists, wars, and cities, all perfectly matching the fake European timeline for no reason at all.
That's the inescapable conclusion, yes. It requires a global conspiracy of impossible scale and synchronization, with no logical motive for the Islamic participants. The continuous documented history of Islam during that period is basically an independent chronological control group. It just devastates the PTH claim.
Okay, checkmate, basically. So, that brings us back to those anomalies Illig pointed out. The historical silence, the sparse records in Europe. If it wasn't a fabrication, why are things so patchy for those 300 years in the West?
Well, the mainstream explanation is much less conspiracy-driven, but maybe more grim. The Dark Ages really were dark. It wasn't a non-existent time. It was a time of genuine catastrophic collapse after the Western Roman Empire fell apart. You had plagues, constant warfare, economic depression, the breakdown of trade, loss of infrastructure, including the infrastructure for education and record-keeping.
So it's not that the time didn't happen. It's just that people were maybe too busy trying not to starve or get killed to write detailed chronicles.
Essentially, yes. Literacy plummeted. Centralized Roman bureaucracy vanished. Power became very local, often held by rulers who couldn't read or write. The need and the ability to keep detailed, continuous records just disappeared in many places for a long time. So the sparse record isn't proof of absence, it's proof of genuine hardship and societal breakdown. Regression, not fiction.
And the architecture argument, that big jump from simple buildings to Romanesque, how does the real chaos theory explain that?
It's probably the same reason. Loss of skills, loss of organized labor, long of the ability to quarry and transport large amounts of stone. They couldn't build big, complex structures for centuries. They built smaller, simpler things, often reusing old Roman stones. When society slowly started to stabilize and reorganize, say around the 10th century, and they wanted to build big again, they often look back directly to Roman techniques they were rediscovering. So it might look like a jump because those intervening centuries of slow, messy, undocumented experimentation were largely lost to time and instability.
Okay, so this deep dive has really laid out two starkly different pictures. On one hand, this wild, controversial phantom time theory, based on anomalies mostly in Western Europe, and on the other, the established history, backed up by overwhelming evidence, especially that independent timeline from the Islamic world.
Exactly. And while PTH is pretty much rejected across the board by historians, archaeologists, astronomers, primarily because of that Islamic calendar evidence and the sheer impossibility of the conspiracy, it still offers something valuable, I think, especially for anyone interested in history. Its value is really about critical thinking. It forces you, the listener, to actually stop and question something as basic as the calendar, to ask for proof for a fact you've always just accepted.
Yeah, it definitely flexes that skepticism muscle, questioning authority and narrative. Always healthy. So, we'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. The phantom time hypothesis itself is almost certainly wrong, but the core idea it relies on, that powerful people might deliberately manipulate historical records for political advantage, that's not entirely crazy, is it? History is full of examples of rulers forging documents, rewriting history, maybe not on a 300-year scale, but certainly tweaking things to legitimize their power. So if we know some manipulation happens, how does that change how you approach any historical document? Maybe this whole exercise challenges you to look closer, to always ask, whose story is this and who benefits from me believing it?
A good question to keep in mind. Until next time, keep digging.